I think I'm unmuted now. So yeah, thanks for attending. And this is going to be a webinar where I talk about using mocha and Boris effects inside of DaVinci Resolve 11, which is pretty great. I think everyone was really excited when DaVinci added OFX support for all of the new plugins that they'd be able to use. And it was really great when Boris stepped up to the plate and added their whole collection to the DaVinci Resolve users toolkit. And for me, what got me really excited when I was first approached about doing this webinar is the notion of using mocha and Boris together to import tracking from mocha in order to do things like corner pinning and moving specific effects around. That to me is just really fantastic. Any chance I get to stay inside of Resolve and do the things I need to do rather than having to bounce out to another application is something that's going to make me really excited as a user. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. So by the way, those of you who are used to my old headshot, this is the most current sort of headshot I've got with my brand new reading glasses, which I'm very excited about. So I'm going to log in. I've got this project I've been working on for the last few weeks, something I shot in December. And it is a scene out of a detective thriller. So it's a narrative scene. And because the point of this webinar is to talk about finishing, I decided to select a handful of plugins to demo that show just that, finishing techniques that you can now do directly inside of DaVinci Resolve using mocha and Boris. Now, those of you who are unfamiliar with DaVinci Resolve, all of these effects are going to be applied inside of the color page of Resolve. Resolve has two main pages where you work: the edit page, where you do your editing, and the color page where you do your coloring. Pretty straightforward. Those of you who are used to NLEs, you can think of the color page as a huge inspector for effects that's dedicated to doing effects work. So instead of having to do a bunch of effects work inside of, for example, a little tiny inspector, which isn't opening for some reason, I can go into the color page and have all the room I want for everything that I need to do. Now, the Boris effects are all found inside of this OFX plugin palette. If I type BCC, I can filter out all of the Boris effects just to show you that it's a huge collection. There are tons and tons of effects that are available, and I'm told you can buy these either in sets to get just the effects you need, or you can buy the whole kit and caboodle, which I've done. And to start things out, I want to take a look at that mocha interoperability that I was mentioning. So I'm going to start with this shot. I'm going to loop it just so you can see what I want to do. The camera's drifting around a little bit, and I have this monitor replacement that I want to do. This is kind of the poster child for using mocha. So I'm going to stop, and before I continue, I'm going to set up my desktop a little bit better so I can work. So I'll hide the gallery, which I don't need. I want to have my Open Effects panel available because this is both the library of effects that I have and the settings for me to adjust. But I also want to make more room for my node view here. These nodes are what allow me to set up and add effects for each shot. And I'm going to use quite a few nodes, so I just want to have room in this view. Now, to start out with, since I'm doing a corner pinning operation, I'm going to go ahead and search for that corner pin plugin. There it is, BCC Corner Pin. And I like showing this plugin because there's no other way inside of Resolve to do corner pinning. So this adds a great capability. And to do that, typically you want to add another node. The way these effects work inside of DaVinci is you add one effect per node. So if I drag that effect on this node, wait a few moments. I should warn you, I'm not using the world's fastest machine. The Boris effects are pretty GPU intensive, especially with DaVinci Resolve. At least some of them are. Because DaVinci Resolve is a GPU renderer and so are the Boris effects. You just want to make sure that you have enough horsepower to run them. So here I've got my default effect. Obviously this is not what I want, but it shows you I've got all of the controls set up to be able to corner pin a graphic inside of this shot. Basically I'm doing all of my compositing inside of this node view here inside of this shot. Now I'm going to want to create the corner pinning effect. So before I do anything else, I'm actually going to remove this OFX plugin for now. I just wanted to show you how you add them. And I'm going to switch over to Mocha. In particular, though, I want to open this shot inside of Mocha, and the fastest way I've found to do so is kind of a three-step process. So first, while I'm inside the color page, I'm going to set this top timecode viewer to source frame, because I want to note the frame range of this particular shot, which is 355. If I go all the way to the end, to 451. Now, because of an idiosyncrasy with how Mocha counts frames relative to how Resolve counts frames, you need to add a frame to the outgoing frame rate in order to get the true frame range you want. So in truth, I want 355 to 452. Once this is done with this shot selected, I'm going to go back to the edit page. I'll zoom in a little bit, because what I want to do is right-click this clip and choose Find in Media Pool. Once I've found it in Media Pool, I can right-click that clip and choose Reveal in Finder. In a few moments, a window should appear, and there's my clip. So at this point, all I've got to do is drag and drop that on top of Mocha Pro down in my dock. An import window appears. And all I need to do is just type in that frame range I identified, 355 to 452. Click OK. I'm not going to overwrite that. I'm going to create a new file. And here I am, ready to work. I've got the right frame range. I've got the shot lined up. Now, clearly I'm seeing the ungraded shot because the grade lives back in Resolve. This is the original log encoded shot, but that's fine because I'm just using this shot to create tracking data, which I'll export all by itself. Now, I'm not the world's most sophisticated Mocha user, but I know enough to get myself into trouble. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly set up a track for this monitor and kind of talk you through it, because I really like the way Mocha works, and it works a little bit differently to the way tracking in Resolve works. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose my X-spline tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and draw a loose shape around the plane that I want to track. This is a planar tracker, so it's looking for flat areas that it can track. And the interesting thing to me is that I'm drawing this shape not to do roto work, but to define the region that I want to track. The actual track data is going to be generated using a different set of coordinates that I'll show you in a little bit. Now, if I scroll through this, I can see that maybe there's a little bit of reflection in the middle of this monitor, and I don't necessarily want that reflection to throw the track. So another thing I can do is press this X plus button to add a shape to the current layer that I've created. I'm going to add that shape inside, and it's going to exclude those reflections. And I can tell how these shapes are intersecting by turning on this Show Layer Mats button. And I can see that this white area, this onion-skinned area, is what's going to be tracked. Now, with that done, there's just one other thing I want to do, and that's to turn on this Show Planar Surface control. when I turn that on, I get this blue box. And this is the interesting thing to me. The blue box is what defines the actual plane that you're tracking. And this blue box is going to be what defines the tracking data that gets exported. Since I'm corner pinning, this blue box is going to be the corner pin. So what I can do is carefully drag each one of these corners to match the corners of this monitor. Now, that monitor is super dark. So another thing I can do is I can turn on this gamma control and then click and twirl with a circular motion to just temporarily crank up the gamma to make it easier for me to see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to go ahead and just park that to match the corners. This one is very hard to see. So I'll look for the other ones that are easier. And I really love that zoomed in window that pops up. And I think that's probably good enough for government work. So with that defined, I can turn on this show planar grid control. And that grid is going to show me how well that corner pinned area is really aligning with what I'm doing. And maybe I want to make a small tweak now that I can see the alignment. So with all of this set up, it's a simple thing for me to go ahead and just click the track forward button and let Mocha do all the hard work. And as it's tracking along, I can watch the grid to make sure that it's continuing to match the surface of the monitor the way I want it to. So that's all good. While I was watching it play, I'm noticing that this upper corner isn't quite really where I want it to be. So the cool thing is I can adjust this blue box anytime I want, and it doesn't affect the tracking data. All I'm doing is redefining the points that are going to be exported as my corner pin track. As I scrub back and forth, I can see that that looks pretty good. And at this point, all I need to do is export the data that I'm going to use back in Resolve. So to do that, I will click this Export Tracking Data button. And when I do that, I get this Export Tracking Data pop-up. And I can choose a variety of formats. Boris Effects has two, center point and corner pin. And the center point is if I want to export the center point of this blue box. So the center of the two diagonals is what's going to get exported. Or I can export the corner pin information. Either way. But you can see that I also have the ability to export all kinds of other data formats for other applications. And I'm told that there's also a way to export data for Fusion, which is the new compositing app that Blackmagic has taken stewardship of. For now, I'm going to export this. I'm going to go ahead and click Save, find a place to put it, and I'm going to call this Computer Monitor Track 5. And at this point, I'm done. I can just quit. I'll go ahead and save that. But I'm not exporting any kind of graphic out of it. I'm just exporting the data. So back in DaVinci Resolve, I can jump into the color page, drop that corner pin plug-in back onto that node. And if I go all the way down to the middle of the parameters for BCC corner pin, you'll see that there's this motion tracker section with tracker data, and I can load my corner pin data. I just have to navigate to where it's been stored. So I go into my VFX folder, there's that Computer Monitor Track 5 I exported. And when I load that in, lo and behold, there's my corner pin. Done, just like magic. Now, I also get to see the motion path itself represented as these lines. I can turn those on or off with a checkbox right here. And by default, it's automatically compositing the shot against itself. Very self-referential, not quite what I want. So there are a couple different ways I can composite another layer into this situation. I'm going to start off by showing you the simple case, and then I'll show the other case in another example. If I go back to the media page, this is inside of Resolve where you import media into the current project. So I'm going to use the library up here to go to my media folder, go inside VFX, and I've got this screen replacement. I'm going to make her into a DaVinci editor. Now, to do this the simple way, I need to import this piece of media not as a clip, but I need to right-click on it and choose Add as Matte. This is an unattached matte for those of you who know Resolve. It's not attached to any particular clip, which means I can use this on any clip in the timeline that I want. Once I've done this, I go back to the color page, and I can go ahead and drag this node over because I'm going to need a little bit of space. Right-click that node in the node editor and choose Add Matte, and then this Track Mattes section shows me all the unattached mattes. Here's the screen replacement. When I choose that, it's brought in as a node. Now, right now, that node is being used to define a matte for transparency. And you can see that the matte output, the little triangle, is attached to the matte input of my node. That's not what I want. So I select that connection line, right-click it, and choose Delete Link. What I want is to create a composite, and one of the cool things about BCC Corner Pin is not only is it a corner pinning node, but it also has compositing built into it. And this was facilitated in version 11 of DaVinci Resolve. In version 11, you can right-click this node and choose Add OFX Input. That actually attaches a second RGB input to this node, so I can now connect the RGB output of my matte to the RGB second input of this node, and I'm almost there. Now I just need to go up to the top, and for corner pin source, choose source B, because that's the second input. And now I've got my tracked in shot. And this works with either a graphic or an image sequence or a movie, whatever format DaVinci supports. Now, to finish this off, if I scroll down, you'll see that I also have a set of composite controls. This includes an apply mode, which is a composite mode. So I can choose, say, screen to screen that against the monitor. And then I have an opacity control if I want to fade that down a little bit, make it a little more subtle. And just like that, I've got my specific match move. Now, there are other ways of doing a match move inside of Resolve that some of you may know, but those are all very much atmospheric scene based. In other words, you can track the whole scene and it's good for something like a sky replacement. It doesn't work so well for doing an object insertion like this or a screen replacement. So this is a really nice tool to have. Now, this works great because there's nothing passing in front of the screen. This is the simplest possible case. But in the event where you did have an occlusion or a more complicated composite that you needed to accomplish, there's another way of doing this that gives us some more options. So to show that, I'm going to move forward to another shot, this phone replacement shot. And the tricky thing about this phone replacement is that her thumb passes in front of the screen in that one corner. So now, not only do I have to do a screen replacement, but I also have to do a little bit of roto. both of which mocha is really good at. So I'm going to show you the next more complicated case. To accomplish this, I'm not going to do the corner pinning as part of a composite inside of this shot. I'm actually going to do it in another layer. So if I go back to the media page, we can see I've got this phone face movie with some blinking graphics. I'm just going to add that to my VFX bin down here as a regular clip. Double click it. It's just another clip. If I go into the edit page, I'll press X to set in and out points to match this shot, and I'm going to edit that clip in as a place on top edit. So now I've got at least the mechanics of my composite all set up and in place. So if I go back to the color page, I'm now looking at adding this tracking to this shot specifically. Now this is a slightly more complicated operation, so instead of going through the whole process of creating it from scratch, I'm going to jump back to the Finder where I've already set up the situation I need for tracking. I imported this clip the same way I did the other one. But this time you can see I've created two layers. I've got a phone track layer, which is actually creating tracking data. But I also have a thumb layer, which is a really fast and not that great roto job that I did, using both the planar tracking and the simple ability to adjust the mat to roto the shape in to follow the track. So with all of this accomplished, I'm well set up to be able to, with the phone track mat selected, go ahead and export my tracking data using the Export Tracking Data button. And I have all the same options, and I obviously want to export corner pin data. But then I also have the option of selecting this thumb roto, and if I click the Show Mat Layers, you can see the area that I am going to be exporting when I choose File, Export Rendered Shapes. And I can export just that selected layer as a QuickTime movie, and I can choose the format I want to export to, and all that good stuff. And by the way, one other thing I get to do in here that's not something I can do in Resolve right now is I get to apply motion blur to that roto job. So it's obviously a terrific roto tool. It's been used in I don't know how many movies. So now you can use it in your own projects with Resolve. So that's pretty cool. So with all of this accomplished, I'm going to go ahead and quit. I don't need to save that for now because I've already exported those things for use in Resolve. So first things first, I'm going to apply BCC corner pin to this layer. And the first thing I see is obviously not at all what I want, but that's okay because I'm going to show you how to set it up. I'm going to scroll down to that tracking data pop-up. I'm going to load my tracking data. And for this, I want the phone track corner pin TXT file. So now it's put it into place kind of how I want it, but there are a few things I need to do first. First of all, I want to get rid of this background. I don't actually want a composite here. I just want the tracked layer. And I can do that by going to Render and choosing corner pin only. When I do that, now I'm just seeing the corner pinned effect. So that's all well and good, but I've got all of this black here. Now, an idiosyncrasy of the way Boris Effects and DaVinci Resolve work together is that this effect does not also corner pin the alpha channel. So because of that, I need to build my own transparency channel. Fortunately, in Resolve, I have a pretty easy way of doing that. I'll create a second node, and I'll go into my qualifier palette. And the qualifier palette, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a keyer, either a chroma keyer or a luma keyer, depending on what you need to do, that usually is used to isolate part of the picture for a dedicated correction, but I can use it in order to create transparency if I'm tricky. So I'm going to go over to Luma. I'm going to turn on my highlight control, and I'm going to drag highlight down because I just want to basically key out this absolute black surrounding the area. Now I know I'm going to want to invert it because I really want this to be the transparent area and not the object that's being quarter pinned. And once I've done that, I can turn that into transparency by turning off my highlight, right-clicking inside of the node view and choosing Add Alpha Output, and then I connect this key to the alpha output. And just like that, I now have the composite I want. It's a bit of a hack, but it works great, so there you go. Now, with this done, I can see that my graphic is being squeezed. Again, it's just the way Resolve is choosing to do the math for all of this, but this is a really easy thing for me to fix. I just go back to the first node, and if I drag up to the top, I can see I've got these crop controls. So I can crop left to just crop out that black that I don't want. And I should warn you, the sliders are a little bit coarse, but you can also drag the numeric portion of each slider in order to get many more decimal places of precision for these adjustments. So that's pretty nice. So I'm just going to drag that out, and I can see my motion path. And if I drag through this, I can see that the graphic is now following the motion of her hand. So that's pretty good, except I still have this thumb that really should be rotoed out. Well, taking care of that is a lot simpler than you might think. First thing I'm going to do to fix that is go back to the media page and find the thumb mat that I exported. And you can see I exported it with motion blur. And just like I did with the previous screen replacement, I'm going to right-click this and choose Add as Matte. Now I could attach it to that one clip because it is clip specific, but just for speed, I'm not. I'm just going to add it as an unattached matte. Go back to the color page, and now what I can do is right-click, choose Add Matte, Track Mattes, Thumb Matte, and this time it's actually doing exactly what I want. It's applying this matte to the matte being created by node 2. It's just doing it in the opposite way that I want. So to fix that, I go to the key palette. For those of you who don't know, the key palette is basically where all of the under the hood controls for keys being attached to a particular node are. And I've got this key input set of controls. So if I click invert, now I've got exactly what I want. Her thumb is being rotoed out and is now coming in front of the screen. If you just needed to make a small tweak to the matte, there's also a blur radius control that you can use if you want to just add a little tiny bit of blur. And I'm almost there. So now I've got my track set up. Everything's good. Because this is really a timeline effect, and it's not a composite being done inside of that node, if I want to screen this in, I have to actually select that clip. And interestingly enough, the demo gods are not smiling on me because they're not letting me click my inspector. I think it has something to do. Oh, Anyway, ordinarily I would open up the inspector, go ahead and set this to screen and alter the opacity right inside of the edit page. I just can't. Oh, there we go. My click targets are a little bit funny. So I'll set this up as a screen, bring the opacity down, and now I've got a slightly more convincing composite. And if I wanted to fine tune it, because it looks like it's not quite fitting in the corners as well as I might like, I can always go back to the color page, and there's a full set of offset controls. So I have these corner offset sliders that I can use to fine tune this. Like I said, they're a little bit coarse, so I'll probably have better luck if I drag the numeric controls. So I can go in there and finesse this as much as I like to create the final effect. So again, a really powerful way of doing things that you can't do in Resolve all by itself, and yet you're still keeping all of the controls inside of Resolve. So those are two different ways of using match moving, but there's another way of doing match moving that's really cool, and this actually matches a lot of feature requests I've seen out in the community. People who have been asking, is there any way to motion track a lens flare? And now there is. So I'm going to go all the way to the beginning, and I've got this establishing shot where the character's walking in an abandoned parking lot, and the grade's pretty good, but I really want to put kind of a dim sun lens flare into the scene. Because the camera is moving around, I need to do some kind of tracking. So what I can do before I get started even is go into Mocha, and this is the world's easiest track. I'm just going to show you how I built it. And what I did is I just selected this building to track, since that's the plane that's farthest in the distance. It's virtually infinity, but it's good enough for this shot. But because the pan is pretty big, I was able to rotoscope that tracking mat so that it keeps from going off screen. This is basically how you do an offset track in Mocha, and it works really great. So if I turn on that blue shape for that layer, I put it where I wanted the sun to be, and as I scrub through, you can see it just goes off screen really beautifully. So again, export that tracking data, which I've already done. I'm going to quit Mocha Pro, go back into Resolve, and now I'm going to add another node that I can drop that flare on. I have a bunch of lens effects. I want lens flare 3D. I'm usually in the habit of adding my open effects in a separate node that's different from nodes doing all of the grading, just so I can easily turn it on and off in a vacuum. But of course, you can always go into the open effects panel and turn the effect off all by itself while leaving that node on. It just depends on how you like to work. So this is a cool flare. It's perhaps a bit spectacular for my needs. Fortunately, there's an effects browser, which right now I have to click twice to open up. And this gives me access to all the library of pre-built effects that Boris has put together. And it's a really great environment for browsing. You can check out different sorts of flares you might want. For this particular project, I like this soft flare colored fog look. But one of the cool things about this is as you browse through different flares you like, Boris remembers the last 10 flares you browsed through. So you can kind of define a tray of favorites and then just focus on them to make up your mind. So with that done, I'm going to click Apply, and I've got my flare in there. And at this point, I need to go down, and you can see there are a ton of ways of customizing this. The one way I know I want to is I don't necessarily want this to be magenta-ish. I'm going to warm up that flare effect so that it integrates into the scene better. And in my own work, I find I increasingly used flares as very diffuse color corrections in and of themselves. That's a whole nother topic of conversation. But with this setup, it's integrated nicely for my purposes. I'm going to continue scrolling down to find the tracking controls. And here we go, tracker data, import, export. Now, an idiosyncrasy of the lens flare filter I have found is that even though you'd think it would only need a point, it actually wants a corner pin track. So I went ahead and exported a corner pin track. I'm finding that track data right now. Establishing SkyTrack corner pin. Now, I import that and nothing happens, because with this particular filter, there's one more step. It doesn't automatically apply the tracking data. Instead, I have to go down to this apply pop-up and choose light source. I'm assuming this is because in other situations I might be able to apply the tracking data to other parts of the flare. I'm just guessing. But as soon as I select light source, now I have exactly the effect that I want. It tracks in very nicely. If I need to fool around, I can offset this. If I go back to my Open Effects overlay, I should have an offset control. I believe it's that one. Maybe not. But yes, I can tweak to my heart's content, and the results are nicely tracked in. And you can also see that all of the elements are doing what they should. So this, for me, is a huge win. Very nice thing to have. But it's not just limited to tracking. So those are all the tracking examples I've got, but there are a lot of other Boris plugins that I think are really, really going to be useful for finishing, and I'd like to go through a few of those before I run out of time. The very first I want to show is lens correction. I can see lens correction right here. So I've got this clip right here. It was shot with a Blackmagic pocket camera, classic trunk shot, but I had to use pretty much a fisheye lens to get the field of view that I wanted, and so I've got this barrel distortion in the image. Again, by itself, DaVinci Resolve doesn't have a tool to correct for this right now, but BCC Lens Flare does. So I'll add another node. I'll drop BCC Lens Flare 3D onto this clip. In a few moments, the correction should appear. I should mention again, I'm using a slightly slower machine. Oh, I added lens flare, didn't I? I want to add lens correction. There we go. So with the correction applied, it overcorrects by default. That's just its default setting. I can just drag this one slider back. It's not necessarily scientific. I'm not sampling horizontal or vertical lines to try and work this out. I'm just eyeballing it, which frankly is what I usually do anyway. So I can straighten that out, and that's cool. But what I really like about the Boris version of this is that if I go to vertical and horizontal perspective, I actually have a slider that lets me tilt the shot a little bit. So if I have perspective that I want to add to it just a little bit, I can. If I do it before, after, I'm done. And I'll tell you, with the the number of GoPro shots that I get, and people using slightly less expensive lenses that perhaps have a little more barrel distortion in them, this is a really, really great effect to have for finishing. So that's lens correction. Another thing that comes up is the occasional dead pixel. So I know that users of NLEs have long hailed the pixel fixer in Boris as something that's saved them. And that's something that we now have access to in Resolve as well. Now, all of my cameras are fantastic and don't have any dead pixels, so I'll need to fake up an example. And in this case, I'm going to use this. Let's say I want to just get rid of that gigantic white dead pixel. We're just pretending. So I'll add a node. And again, using my search field, I'm going to find pixel fixer. I'm going to drop that on. And this very first pair of crosshairs is the pixel fixer. Now, this plugin has provisions for additional points of pixel fixing as well. I'm just going to show the one. Hopefully one will be all you ever need. And if I zoom in to this shot, you can see what's happening. Boris is using whatever magic it's using to go ahead and pull image data surrounding that pixel to make the problem go away. I can also increase the size of this. And you can see that's pretty much all there is to it. Really fantastic filter. If you've got dead pixels, I can't recommend this highly enough. In the same category of making problems go away, there's also a really cool wire remover filter. And it's the kind of thing where if you're not doing heavy-duty effects work, you may ask yourself, why would I care about that? But things like that come up in weird instances. So here I've got this establishing shot of the woman in her fishbowl office. And by sheer coincidence, it has two big pieces of plate glass joined together with the seam down the middle. That's reality. That's the way this very expensive office complex was put together. But maybe your director or producer would prefer it went away. This is a perfect thing you can use wire remover for. So if I choose wire, again, I'll add another node. I'll drop wire remover on there. And I'm confronted with a variety of on-screen controls. Now, an issue with the way these plugins get exposed inside of Resolve is that Resolve doesn't have tooltips for the on-screen controls. So at first you may wonder, well, what do I do? But the folks at Boris showed me a cool tip. If you go to the View menu and choose Preview Area, it draws a line between the two crosshairs you care about. So now all I need to do is just drag those crosshairs to appear at the top and at the bottom of that seam. I could adjust the width and feathering and play around with all kinds of other parameters if I wanted to. But in truth, if I simply go back to viewing the render, I can now see that that seam has just gone away. I love this. I wish all filters were just like that. Apply them and it does what you want and you're good. So that's wire remover. Again, the kind of thing that'll come up for finishing all the time. Really nice. Another cool finishing-oriented plugin, or at least it's for finishing if you think the way I think, is the Magic Sharp plugin. Now, Resolve has built-in sharpening, but Boris gives you another kind of sharpening tool that can be really good in some other situations. So let's take a look at one of those. I've got this shot right here, and this is a push-in. If I go back to sizing, I can reset this, and I can see that this is the original framing of the shot, but the director wanted it to be like this. So one of the things that happens when you push in is any noise you have gets exaggerated, because each grain of noise is going to be enlarged along with the rest of the image. So as I scrub through this, maybe there's just a little more noise than I wish it had. So I'm going to add another node, and I'm going to start out using the built-in noise reduction in Resolve. It has both temporal and spatial noise reduction. So I'll set the number of temporal frames to 1. I'm just going to add a little bit of temporal noise reduction, mainly for the background. And then I'm going to crank up the spatial noise reduction, because I really don't want any noise. I really want to smooth her out. So it's looking good. The noise is definitely gone, but there's just a little teeny tiny bit of softening that's resulted as a function of me noise reducing such a blown up image. I mean, this is almost 200 and, well, yeah, this is just over 200%. So this is where Magic Sharp can be a real bonus. So if I add a third node, I'm going to type in Magic to get Magic Sharp. Now drop that on, and what's unique about Magic Sharp, first off, it uses a different algorithm than the one that DaVinci uses. And I'm not going to say that it's better, I'm just going to say that it's different. It works in a different way. So it can lend you a different quality if you want to compare the two. What's interesting about it is that on the one hand, you have a set of master controls, sharpen, amount, threshold, and radius. But you also have a set of tuning controls that allow you to exaggerate or diminish the sharpening in specific regions of the image. Effectively, this is a qualified sharpness control. So you can affect whether the sharpness affects fine, small, medium, or coarse detail. You can choose how much sharpening is applied or not applied to different channels, luma, chroma, or RGB. Most tantalizingly to me, there's a set of range tuning controls which allow you to apply sharpness specifically to the highlights, midtones, and shadows. And they work really nicely. I have a range preview control, so I can get a preview of the currently qualified shadows, and I can use shadow range and low range to modify this. So I can either exclude shadows or bring more shadows in using shadow range, and then I also have the option to use mid-tone low range, which effectively lets me change the feathering between these areas. And what I'm trying to do for this shot is I'm trying to isolate the darkest areas of detail. I'm trying to basically isolate lines of detail that I can sharpen to give the illusion of greater sharpness. So with this set up, I'm going to turn my range preview off. I'm going to diminish highlight sharpening. I'm going to leave mid-tone sharpening a little higher and maybe exaggerate shadow sharpening. And then I'm going to go up to the top, and now I'm going to turn up my sharpening amount. Not a lot, just a little. I don't want to inadvertently bring any harshness back into this image, especially since it's a close-up of an actor. And if I turn this off and on, you can see the difference. That little bit of sharpening makes all the difference in terms of giving a little bit of crispness back to the image, especially over her clothes, in her hair, around her lips. It just gives the audience that illusion they need of crispness. So BCC Magic Sharp, very cool tool to have inside of Resolve alongside the existing tools. And by the way, one thing I'll mention is also for finishing, if you're mixing different sizes of media, there's also a BCC UpRes filter that I'm told integrates the Magic Sharp technology as a preset inside of it, so that you can blow up imagery and sharpen it at the same time, whether you're bringing SD material into an HD program or HD material into a 4K program. And there's also a deinterlacer that's available in Boris Effects. And the deinterlacer is of note because DaVinci Resolve doesn't do any deinterlacing at all. So I haven't really used it, so I can't speak to how it works, but it is there. So between that and UpRes, you have additional mastering capabilities. So I'll leave you with one last thing. Everything I've shown you so far has been very compositing oriented and very utilitarian, let's say. But we are artists, after all, and I did want to show you one kind of fun thing. And again, a way that Boris Effects can extend what DaVinci Resolve already does. DaVinci is a fantastic grading environment. I love it. But one thing DaVinci doesn't have built into it is a whole lot of control over image texture. And one way of defining image texture is, of course, to completely redefine it using stylization. So if I go back to the big list, I can see that I have a whole set of art looks, including charcoal sketch and halftone and pencil sketch, very Photoshop sorts of things that I wouldn't necessarily use all by themselves, but incorporated with DaVinci's other tools, these give you an enormous amount of freedom to create texturally interesting grades, more graphic sorts of effects. And for this shot, let's just say I'm looking to create an interesting title sequence, and I want to build it right inside of Resolve. So I'm going to add another node, and the first thing I'm going to add is this halftone plugin. And that gives me, at first, a fairly unexciting, somewhat noisy halftone, but who cares for presets? I'm going to go ahead and scale that up. And now I've got what I want, kind of a very zip tone look to this image. And that's a good starting point, but this is a title sequence, so I want to find an interesting way of having text incorporated into this look. And Boris has, interestingly enough, a text plugin that you can use from inside the color page. So instead of being a generator that you apply in the edit page, this is something that you can do as part of a color composite inside of Resolve. And so what I'm looking for is the extruded text plugin. So I'm going to drop that onto a subsequent serial node. And extruded text basically blows away whatever was in the image before and replaces it with its own generated imagery. So if I launch the text window, I'm going to type the name of the project. An unwanted job. I want to make sure that it's centered. And when I apply that, you can see what I end up with is this really cool pseudo 3D beveled text. And I've got a ton of controls for customizing it. I can change the lighting. I can add more lights. I mean, there's just so much I can do with this. And of course, I'm going to personally do the most boring thing I can think of. I'm going to cut the depth, and I'm going to reduce the bevel amount, because I'm going to use this in a slightly different way. So I've got two different pieces that I want to composite together. I can do this using a layer node. So if I press Option L, I create a new node connected to a layer mixer. So I've basically got the text and my graphic effect attached to this layer mixer node. And if I right-click the layer mixer node, I can choose composite modes. And in this case, I'm going to choose overlay. So that's cool. It's a start. But what I really want is for the textured, my gosh, say that 3 times quickly, the textured text to appear over the textured background. And to do that, I'm going to select the text layer, and I'm going to go back to that key palette, which, if you recall, controls the matte for a particular node, and I'm going to turn the overall background matte to 0.8. So I'm basically going to fade that down. And so now I've got this great textured light text against a darker background. And of course, that's just the beginning. Maybe I want to give this whole treatment a little bit of color, so I could add another node, go back here, and maybe I throw the highlight to a warmer tone, and on and on and on and on. So there are enough Boris plugins for me to spend the rest of the week showing you stuff, but these are the highlights that I thought would be interesting, and I believe I'm out of time, so I'm going to throw it back to my colleagues. Thank you.